Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Our program will begin in just a moment. Welcome to AJC Europe's Today's program. The US press coverage of the most recent events in France have led many to deplore a lack of knowledge, or at least a misunderstanding of the French reality and perspectives on the other side of the pond. This has been notably the case after the beheading of the teacher Samuel Paty, but it also seems to encompass many timely issues, such as the debates on race, on free speech, or on laïcité. It also revealed that the divide on those issues is not necessarily a transatlantic one, but rather the affrontment of opposing views. In order to discuss these approaches, it is our absolute pleasure to welcome James McAuley, Paris correspondent for the Washington Post and author of the forthcoming book, The House of Fragile Things, Jewish Art Collectors and the Fall of France, and Thomas Chatterton Williams, the author of a memoir, Losing My Cool and Self-Portrait in Black and White, and a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. They will be in conversation with Simone Rodin-Benzaken, General Manager of AJC Europe. Before giving them the floor, I remind our audience that questions can be asked via Zoom, Q&A, chat. Simone, you and our guests have the floor.
Thank you very much, Julie. Hello, James. Hello, Thomas.
Hi.
It's really a great pleasure to be hosting you today. Thank you for the audience for switching in. As I mentioned earlier on in our conversation before we went live, I've really been wanting to organize this conversation for a while, because I sometimes believe that when you look at these very complicated issues, we have a tendency to have, sort of a debate between France and the United States, but the reality is, I believe it's a little bit more complex. So I hope that today we'll get a little bit of nuance and complexity in this conversation. And so without further ado, maybe to start out with something very simple. We call this program Two Americans in Paris. I have personally actually lived here in several countries. And just like you, I'm not originally from France. I'm not from the United States, but I'm from Germany. And I've come to understand that living abroad often allows you to sort of have a different perception of yourself, about the country you live in, about the country that you left. And I was wondering if you could speak to me a little bit about what it feels like to live in France, and whether moving here has taught you anything about yourself, your own identity, the country that you're in, the country that you left. Maybe, Thomas, if we could start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much for hosting this. It's really, I think it's really important to have these kinds of conversations, even during a pandemic, when we have to meet virtually. I first moved to France in 2003 for 1 year, and I was fresh out of university, and I was living in Lille in the north, and teaching English in Roubaix for 10 hours a week, and spending the rest of the time just reading books and bumming around cafes and luxuriating in a kind of freedom from American society and perceptions and kind of experimenting with my own identity. And one of the things that I noticed first was in this area, I was often mistaken for being someone from the Maghreb, which was quite surprising to me because growing up in New Jersey, where I was, and then going to school in Washington, DC, I'm a mixed race Black man in America, but my identity was never questioned. In America, the way race is constructed and made, we have a Black-white binary. And, you know, there's the idea of the one-drop rule, and things are pretty cut and dried. And in France, my race was not obvious, and my nationality took precedence over my racial identity. And so it was shocking to be interpreted in ways other than which I saw myself. But upon returning back as an adult in Paris in 2011 and making a family here, I've felt even freer from the kind of American skin game that we obsess over and play all the time. And I've felt that I've been able to step outside of some of the racial madness that I hadn't realized was so suffocating until I left the States. So that's a long way of saying that moving to France was, in a way that is tried and true for many Black American expatriates, it was racially liberating for me. And then on top of that, you know, the idea of the Republican ideal and a society that aspires to colorblindness, it was something that I bought into, and that seemed quite refreshing from the American perspective I was leaving.
Interesting. And so when you look at both the US and France today, do you still view this in the same way, or do you have a different perspective today about sort of the identity that both on both sides of the Atlantic?
Well, I think America's gone off the rails in so many ways. So I always have the eyes of a European when I'm coming back to America, and when I'm in France, I feel very much like an American. So one of the things that's happened is that it's made me somewhat homeless in both societies. But in France, you know, I'm quite aware of the degree to which an American identity is the real prominent identity I carry. We all are multitudes. I have, like you and James, I have many different kinds of aspects of an identity, but here being an American is important, as it is all over the world, and it's quite a privilege. And so I realized that I have an experience in France that is not exactly the same as many people coming from other parts of the world who try to make a life here. And the salient identity for me is a national one.
Interesting. James, what about you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much, Simone, for having us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Thomas. It's a really interesting question, and I haven't thought about that in a really long time. I think for me, basically my story is as follows. I was born and raised in Dallas, and ever since I was a kid, I was extremely enamored with the French language and French culture and history, because I was very fortunate to travel a lot in France with my parents when I was a kid, and it just kind of stuck in the way that things do when you're that age, that sort of young, impressionable age. And I did a summer at the Dallas International School, where I was my first sort of proper introduction to French, and I remember mostly the teacher speaking English heavily accented. But then as I got older—
That's usually the case.
Right. An important thing to understand before you move to France, for sure. And then as I got older, it sort of became my course of study. So as an undergraduate, I began doing French history and literature. And then for my PhD, I did French history, focusing mostly on the period between Dreyfus and Vichy, which has always really fascinated me, and I think has so many relevant connections to what we see today in various ways. And then after I finished my PhD, which was about 5 years ago-ish now, I moved here to work as a reporter for the Washington Post. And I have been here ever since. And it has been an incredible time with all of the news that's happened since then. But to answer your question about how it's kind of played with my sense of self and my relationship to France and to the US. I think for me, the biggest thing that's happened is that while I have never been, nor do I come from a family of sort of chest beating, American kind of rah-rah patriot kind of sentiment. I mean, I do think that when you are from the United States and you were born as I was in 1989, just around the time of the Berlin Wall fall, the end of the Cold War, you have this sense of American exceptionalism that is so deeply ingrained, even if you, yeah, I don't know if Thomas feels the same way, but I think it really is for people of especially like my age, it's just so much the way we see the world because I grew up in the 1990s, the so-called holiday from history, or what was often called in certain quarters, the holiday from history. And the notion is that America is just sort of, it is the end of history. It's sort of prior to, it's a form of government that's the way everything is headed. It's what we're all going to turn into eventually. And that's what many of us believed. And I think even if I questioned deeply certain aspects of that, and as I mentioned, I come from Texas, so there's a lot to question down there. But I think that I had that sort of deeply ingrained in me, and I never really critically examined it until, I mean, I should say I did my PhD in the UK, so I had sort of begun that before. But when I moved to France officially, I mean, that was when, for instance, Trump was elected, and that, I think, challenged a lot of assumptions that at least I had up to that point. And I think that's been a very healthy experience for me. I think it forces you to interrogate your own assumptions, at least as I have mine, and to think of yourself as somebody who is, I mean, as Thomas says, sort of related to each place, not necessarily circumscribed by one entirely. So I would say that for me, that's been the main benefit of living here. It's a great privilege.
Interesting. Now, sort of moving on to a little bit sort of the more sort of contemporary debates right now, but that are linked to the issue of identity and Thomas, you mentioned the issue of race. The killing of George Floyd, that was shocking, horrendous for all of us to watch. We probably watched it before anyone else because we woke up before anyone else in the United States. It created quite a reaction, to say the least, in the US, but also really around the world, with massive demonstrations, a shockwave really, including here in France. How do you explain this, given sort of some of the debates about race and racism here as well? And do you think the two situations can really be compared? Maybe if we can start out with you, Thomas.
Yeah, I think that was a combination of factors. One of which is that, we have seen several really shocking videos of extrajudicial killings of unarmed Black men. So it's become kind of a technological vocabulary that we have. It's become a meme in a way. And this one is by far the most shocking in many ways because of the duration of the video and the lack of a threat and him calling for his mother. Many things that really, I think, it's impossible to look at that video and not to be deeply moved. I also think that it's very much a matter of it coming during the world being locked down during a global pandemic and many people suffering in many different palpable ways, people being unemployed, deeply frustrated. The height of a very vicious campaign for president in which many Americans felt that we were on the cusp of turning into something very dark and fascistic and intolerant towards non-whites, and an ongoing conversation about, white supremacy and systems of domination. And so all of these things came to a head. I think that many Black people, have been aware of killings like this, and it was less shocking to Black Americans than I think it was to non-Black Americans, but that the moment was one in which Black people were being heard freshly. And, you know, a lot of non-Black people wanted to be seen and probably wanted to see themselves as participating in a rejection of this aspect of our society. With that said, I think it's really surprising the degree to which it resonated beyond the borders of the United States in societies that don't even have Black people, for example, in South Korea, in Japan, in Finland. You know, how many tens of thousands of people gathered in Amsterdam, let alone in France. But with that said, the social conditions of the United States are very different than they are in Europe and other parts of the world. And I think it's very tempting to draw comparisons and analogies between situations, especially when dealing with people who are non-white in majority white societies. But I don't think that George Floyd necessarily tells us everything we need to know about contexts outside of the United States.
Now, James, related to this, and I don't know to what extent our audience knows about it, we've seen one of the reasons why we had these demonstrations also here in France was because of Assa Traoré, the sister of a young man who was killed while in police custody, but whose case is very different from the one, of course, of George Floyd. And
she's of course been given this honor by Time magazine recently.
That's exactly, absolutely. That's exactly what I wanted to refer to. And there's been quite a lot of criticism. So she was on the cover of Time magazine. There's been quite a lot of criticism here in France about the fact that she is. About that once again, sort of the impression that, you know, sort of an American vision or is once again opposed on France, and that, you know, the situations can't be compared. I've seen numerous comments on social media saying that, you know, if you want to put up someone, there are from France, there are sufficient people to be put up, including you know, Samuel Paty, Mila. Why is Assa Traoré on there? What do you say about this criticism? Does any of this resonate with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question. And I myself have certainly received my share of criticism for articles we have done on this and other topics. I think it's a huge topic area to explore. So I'll do my best to sort of start at the beginning and be as clear and concise as possible. Okay, so I completely take Thomas's point that, you know, different societies are different. They have different histories, different cultures, different mores, different relationships to identity, race, ethnicity. No argument here, absolutely. But to speak about France specifically, I mean, I think that one of the criticisms that, you know, I myself have received for reports that we have done, and that I've seen levied at pretty much every other American journalist working in France these days, is that we as American journalists do not understand this French notion of universalism. And that's a really interesting idea, of course. And I think my response would be, and by proxy, that writing about people, or that putting Assa Traoré, for instance, or right, she wasn't on the cover of Time, but by giving her this honor at Time magazine is a means of transposing our own racial politics onto France and our coverage of France and seeing France through American eyes. And, you know, I think in some instances, there might be some evidence for, you know, particular interpretations being influenced by American eyes in that way, or by American perspectives. But, you know, on the whole, I'm not convinced. And I say that because, you know, I think, you know, Americans like me, for instance, are incredibly enamored with the ideal of French universalism, right? It is this sort of beautiful construction that comes I mean, flawed in its execution, of course, and as with everything, much more
like all ideals.
Exactly, right. But it's this amazing ideal and a really beautiful aspiration. But what we see are kind of cracks in the surface, and some of those might be like a great example. Okay, so this summer, around the time of the Assad Traoré resurgence, the Justice pour Adama, her movement, when it became sort of in the headlines again after George Floyd, and it's important to know that the actual killing of Adama Traoré in police custody occurred in 2016, so it's been quite some time, but it kind of came all the way back because of George Floyd this summer. And, we were accused for writing about this in a certain way as, kind of projecting the George Floyd story onto a French case that was totally different. But I mean, what I would say to critics is that, okay, yes, like this is a society that aspires to be universal, but then how do you explain, for instance, the comments of Jacques Toubon, this government's own ombudsman, who said that statistics show, and by the way, Jacques Toubon is a former conservative government minister, okay, so he's not a sort of identity activist, so to speak, at all, really. And he said that, in the issue of police checks, young men under the age of 25 are 20 times more likely to be stopped by police if they are perceived to be Black or Arab, okay? So a society like France that styles itself to be colorblind and that does not distinguish between citizens based on race, ethnicity, or religion, and indeed, keeping those statistics has been illegal even since 1978. I mean, that shows me that the universal society isn't necessarily universal in practice, or the society that is devoted to this notion of universalism in theory is not necessarily so in the way it actually functions. And then, I mean, it's worth reminding our viewers that, I mean, what was the big issue 2 weeks ago? The Zecler affair. I mean, so this notion that somehow police brutality, and specifically along the lines of race, is a unique American obsession. I mean, I just don't see how you can argue that anymore. This was a the Zecler case involved a Black music producer being beaten up by, well, I guess 3 active officers and then 1 watching in his own home in the 17th arrondissement of Paris. And I mean, of course, all of these cases are complicated, and I'm not doing a good enough job, describing all of the details of them. But on the whole, I mean, I think what distinguished the Zecler case is that there's footage of it, and it's been condemned by Macron and by pretty much every government minister. There's been promises to sort of overhaul police conduct, and then also backtracking on this sort of another law about whether citizens should be able to film police. But I'm rambling. I think in general, though, what I mean to say is that there tends to be, I'm always interested to hear from French critics that there's an assumption that among many of them that American journalists like me sort of seek to impose our culture as a kind of cultural imperialism. But I would argue that it's not that at all. It is looking at the ideal that the French government and society holds itself to, and pointing out as I mentioned, the cracks in the surface, which is what journalists do, in the hopes of showing the gap, and then that someone may fix them. I mean, that's really it doesn't strike me as a particularly controversial proposition, but it often is received that way here.
I have too many issues to address. Thomas, do you want to respond to that, or do you want to move on to a different subject?
Quickly respond. I think that the Zecler affair was execrable. It was abominable. There's not much debate about that. It seemed to be a clear-cut case of both police brutality and some pretty vicious racism. I think that where comparisons between France and the United States fall apart is when we try to make it seem as though the police are anywhere near as deadly or as militant as they are in the United States. There's just no comparison between any wealthy Western nation and the United States in terms of applying force from the police on civilians of any race. The United States kills over 1,000 civilians a year in contact with law enforcement. 500 of those will be white in any given year. France is well under 100 in a nation of over 65 million. So I mean, the numbers aren't there to make the case that there's anything like a epidemic of police violence against French citizens, even though I don't doubt that there is quite a lot of lived racism, the experience of racism when you have the intersection of skin color and poverty and banlieue neighborhoods that are an indicator of both poverty and proximity to crime. I have no doubt that this is a tangled mess that oftentimes gets swept under the rug of colorblindness. And we do have to have conversations about how we make sure in the quest to be a universal society that lives up to an ideal that I think is very worthy, an ideal that denies the existence of an illusion, which is the idea of biological racial difference. In the quest to live up to that, we have to make sure that we don't create systems of inequity that are in themselves just as bad as what we're trying to overcome. With that said, I want to talk about something that Jake mentioned, which is the criticism that American journalists come in for. And I think that in this debate around the American media, journalists on the ground in France who are reporting and who have a lot of experience with French society and who speak the language are oftentimes being done a disservice by journalists at some of their same publications back in the United States who have a lot less familiarity with French society and who have been eager to kind of talk about France in a way that makes sense to American readers through this lens of social justice and racial reckoning that we're engaged in now. I can't think of an example that gets to the heart of what's so wrong in the American coverage of France better than Karen Attia, who is an op-ed editor at the Washington Post, who in a critique of Macron wrote that the attack, meaning the decapitation of Samuel Paty, was a national, quote, was a national trauma for a non-Muslim population that fears Islam. On the other hand, many Muslims find themselves on the receiving end of discrimination and Islamophobia, end quote. What she did was actually what many racists do, which is to sever Muslims entirely from the larger French population and to make it seem as though they have separate interests, separate loyalties, and that they only experience life through the lens of Islam and through the lens of oppression and Islamophobia, which is not the way that many people of Muslim descended backgrounds see themselves. And the idea that a decapitation of a public servant like a school teacher was only shocking to non-Muslims, I think it manages to insult both Muslims and non-Muslims and all of France at the same time. And it doesn't advance the conversation, and it actually does harm to the journalists in France who are working hard to try to tease out all of the complexities of these situations. So I think that it's unfortunate that all of this gets lumped together as the American media.
James, I see you want to respond before I ask my next question.
Yeah, I mean, or however
Can we do it? No, go ahead. I give you 1 minute.
Yeah, no. I mean, look, I agree. There is often a big difference between stuff people write on opinion desks, thousands of miles from France, and the actual coverage generated here. But another part of the question, though, is, I mean, think about the things that opinion writers produce in the US every day at American newspapers about American politics. There is an extreme sensitivity here, and we all know it's true, about what American media says about France in general. And there is this sort of notion that on the whole, and I agree with you, Thomas, that there are kind of completely off-base things that have been written and said. But on the whole, I find the assumption is that the role of the outside observer is to essentially see, well, yes, of course, like as a foreign observer, you should see the society you cover as it sees itself as part of your ability to do your job. But like the assumption I find often is that the foreign correspondent or the commentator or the visitor or whatever should essentially kind of repeat the line of the French political elite, no questions asked, that you should also sort of share in this sort of conformist approach to these rather controversial topics that have any number of different interpretations, and that a lot of the ire has come from that, if I may.
Thank you. I have too many topics I still want to cover. Thomas, so together with, I think, more than 150 journalists, authors, writers, you published a letter in Harper's Magazine decrying what you call the intolerant climate that has set in on all sides of the debate. The letter itself created quite a lot of attention, let's put it that way, and also quite a lot of debate and controversy over free speech, privilege, and the role of social media in public discourse. I was wondering whether you could provide us a little bit with some context on why you thought it was important to write this letter, and whether you see some of this also happening here in France, or whether it's really sort of an American issue.
Sure. Well, so this letter really resonated around the world, and I would say it resonated in the UK and France more than anywhere else. Le Monde devoted quite a lot of coverage to it. It also translated it. The letter was published in 8 languages, I believe, and Le Monde was one of the first places to republish it and to really take the issue seriously. But the letter comes out of a kind of concern that was fundamentally American at the time of us writing it, which was that on the one hand, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. That's an extraordinary authoritarian, illiberal threat. And on the other hand, our liberal institutions, our cultural, media, academic institutions, our museums, places that are supposed to uphold liberal values of tolerance for opposing views, of free inquiry, of free thought and expression, of opposition to public shaming and mob justice. These places were succumbing to another kind of illiberalism that was coming often from the left. And so they were failing at their job of standing up to the creeping authoritarianism on the right. And so liberals were being squeezed from both sides. So we wrote this document and we circulated it and had quite a lot of support from many writers, not just the so-called white elites that we've been accused of defending, but from people like Kamel Daoud, who is one of my favorite writers in the French language and who lives with great courage in Algeria. We've had refugees from Iran who signed it. We've had Black writers in America, including Cornel West, but also a guy named Reginald Dwayne Betts, who did 8 years in an adult prison as a child for a carjacking, and said that he was concerned with societies that are becoming unforgiving. So this kind of, this was a response to very American dynamics. But what really struck me in the past 6 months since we published it in July was the extent to which it reverberated around the world, and which people in other cultures felt that it was putting a finger on tendencies that they were noticing within their own societies. My own experience here in France is that it is not the same here in France yet as it is in America, but that there's a younger generation who would like to import an American way of kind of doing business and would like to bring an American style identity politics and power struggle into French institutions that I think maybe is what people are responding to in the letter. There's a sense that this is in the States now, and it's probably to a greater extent in the UK and other English-speaking societies, and that it's coming here soon.
Thank you, James. I don't know if you want to say something about the letter, but I want to sort of there's a related topic to that, and that's the piece that Barry Rice wrote in Tablet Mag, and I believe you've read it, and that basically says that there is today sort of that American liberalism is actually in danger from a new ideology. She actually has a difficulty in sort of finding the term for it, that defining it, whether it's identity politics, critical race theory, but sort of something coming from the left, and that it has sort of dangerous implications for Jews. What's your perspective on this? And I don't know if you also want to say something specifically about the letter that Thomas and the 150 others published.
It's an interesting question. Do you mean in my perspective on this in the US, which is mostly what she's writing about,
yes.
or in France?
Both.
Well, I don't know. It's a complicated issue because on the one hand, I thought that Barry's piece was extremely well written and very nuanced and very important, in a good contribution to the debate that doesn't often get that much attention. But I don't know. I mean, from my personal perspective, which I'm not sure if that is interesting to anyone on this call, on a topic that I don't cover, is just that, look, my experience of American life at this point, and I speak as somebody who comes from Dallas, I mean, I don't know how anyone can look at what is happening in the US today and feel that, and not feel that the biggest threat to American liberalism is what has just happened after the election. I mean, that to me is just so jarring. That is truly unprecedented. A party defeated fair and square at the polls that refused to concede until basically today, and sued, attempted to overturn the process at every juncture. And that's the part that makes me feel like my liberties are at stake. Not so much, I mean, I agree that there are absolutely excesses in these, cultural institutions. But I mean, I should say that I also left college right before this, undergraduate in America, sort of before this seems to have all begun. So I have not experienced this sort of what is often called campus culture personally. Or I guess I experienced campus culture. It was just a different thing back then. But anyway, I just, I guess what I'm saying is I think that she's absolutely right to point out the issue, and I agree with her concerns, but I think that there's, and I should say, I don't think that she does this in the piece, but I think that the way that these things are often read is to create an equivalence between what we are seeing on the right in America and what we are seeing on the left. And I think that that equivalence is false, given just the stakes that are on the table at this particular moment. I may be wrong. We'll see what happens in the years ahead. But I mean, right now, with the election having happened the way it has happened, and 300,000 Americans dead of a entirely preventable epidemic, or not entirely preventable, but certainly more than we have done. I don't know. I do wonder.
It wasn't preventable.
I do wonder, but I mean, no, but I mean, the carnage was preventable.
Yeah.
We do not need to have the richest country in the world, not even in the world, in the history of the world, did not need to lose 300,000 people unnecessarily, but we did. And I mean, to me, it's those things that cause me to think that what is often called sort of illiberal trends in institutions, et cetera, are perhaps given a little bit more airtime than the other. And then also, I think that, and anyway, I'm rambling. That's my response to the question before it becomes 3 hours. So.
Okay, James. Very quickly, what did you think of the letter? Is there of Barry's piece?
I'm sorry, what did I think of the letter or Barry's piece?
Thomas. Thomas. What did you think of the piece?
Oh, like that piece, I think is really powerful. And, it was fundamentally talking about the specific threat that Jews face in being erased as a minority group and being conflated with white interests and white power. And she was, I think, in writing in Tablet, she was drawing attention to the ways in which Jews are a kind of a case apart, unallowed to have their own interests in a world that is busy tabulating all minority groups' interests and comparing them with each other. So I thought, she linked this larger debate about illiberal trends and kind of critical race theory and the Great Awakening, you know, the idea that what started on campus has broken out of the campus gates, and that we all live on campus now, especially in elite institutions. She linked that to a specific Jewish problem that is a kind of old problem in these societies, which is that Jews can be scapegoated or can lose their own ability to advocate for themselves if they aren't mindful of these things. So I think it was a really smart piece. I don't know how much you want to get into a conversation about the Great Awakening, but I think that is the kind of term that Matthew Iglesias used that I think gets at what is going on in America, but also what has caught attention in France and what some activists and writers would like to see become more prevalent in France, which is the idea that universal values, colorblind society, that these are in fact, these are methods of reproducing unequal dynamics in society that serve entrenched white interests, and that what multi-ethnic societies really are is a battle royale, all against all, zero-sum power struggle. And so I fundamentally, to bring it back to the beginning of the conversation, I don't think that France achieves a better society by buying into these concepts that come from America that were originally influenced by some French theorists in the university. I think that France, you know, I think that Macron has advocated for this imperfectly, but that he has a point that has to be taken seriously, that there are other ways about thinking about how to make a multicultural society work than the American model. And as we have seen since all summer, and as we've seen under the past 4 years of Trump, American society has a lot of problems. And I'm not sure that other societies should necessarily try to replicate our racial dynamics as the way forward.
If I could respond to that.
You absolutely can, and then I will take questions from the audience because I don't want to take too much time, even though I have about 10 other questions.
I mean, I think it's quite interesting what Thomas says about how there are different models of multicultural societies, and I think that's 100% true. But again, to return to this notion of an American importation that has to be sort of opposed in France. I mean, to me, what I find so interesting is that a lot of the problems that I have, or not problems, frustrations that I have heard in my reporting on these issues here from French citizens of color, French Muslims, French citizens of African descent, etc., stems from the fact that there is racism in France, but not necessarily a language with which to describe or condemn it. And that because of this sort of colorblind approach to organizing society, which has its obvious advantages, certainly, and it's a noble response to a shameful episode in history. We all agree. But what I have heard from many of the people that I have interviewed is that every time the complaints are aired publicly, credibility is impugned. The complaints are thrown out because, and look at I mean, I'm always struck by the word games that we get in the French press sort of at every juncture. So this summer, you know, one of the debates was about whether or not you can use the word white privilege in France because of the legacy of the French Revolution and the connotation of the word privilege and all of this. Fair enough. But I mean, if you don't like the term being used, then if your goal is, I mean, then find another one to describe the problem, I would say, because if you don't find another term, it just sort of serves to shut the discussion down, at least in the eyes of these people. And I don't know, I think that is where a lot of the frustration comes from. I mean, and even today, you know, I'm struck by how many of the French political elites, you know, they hate the term Islamophobia because of, I mean, and you can argue legitimately that, you know, it does, the construction of the term, you know, essentializes French citizens of Muslim origin in the confines of their religion, which may or may not correspond to their experience. But the term is clearly responding to a phenomenon that we all know exists, and attacking the term, is often a means of, I think, attacking the debate, and I think that's what causes a lot of the friction. But then by the same token, Islamophobia is to be avoided, but then the term Islamo-leftism, for instance, that is a term that government ministers use as something that needs to be rooted out. So I mean, I think that the issue of language is key. And yes, it is true that some of the terms used by some of these activists and particularly French people of color do come from the American lexicon, but I think that's because there isn't necessarily much else available for them to describe the experiences that they have, or so I have been told. And I think that the onus then, if the terms are not to be used, is to come up with something that works for France, but that doesn't really seem to be the game.
So I think the term that the French use mostly on is anti-Muslim racism, but that's for another conversation. Julie, I think there are questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Simone. Before reading you out the questions, I remind everybody that questions can be asked through the chat in Zoom. The first question is for James. Actually, about the article you recently wrote, and of which the headline said, instead of fighting systemic racism, France wants to reform Islam. And so there were some people in French criticizing this, your take on this article. So can you maybe reply on the criticism, and what did you think of this criticism?
I'm not sure, what was the criticism exactly?
I'm reading the rest of the question, that the notion of systemic racism in France was mentioned in the article.
Well, I would first point out it was mentioned in the headline, which is what this question seems to be about. But fine, let's talk about the headline. Okay, so that article is about that at the time. So this is all about Macron's push to combat what was initially called Islamist separatism, but that last week when we got the actual text of the law, that term is not in it. So it's really about strengthening, now it's about, I can't remember verbatim, but it's-
reaffirming Republican values.
Values, yes. Thank you, Simone. And so it's been a huge debate, and I should note that began before these horrible series of attacks that we've had this fall. He gave, the President Macron gave what I thought was a very, very strong and very nuanced speech in the Paris suburb of Les Mureaux in early October, a few weeks before, or maybe like even just 10 days or so before Samuel Paty's beheading. And in that speech, in which, yes, there was a sort of blueprint for reorganizing the way the Muslim faith is essentially set up and organized in France, by certificate programs for imams, cracking down on foreign funding for Muslim organizations and community centers. The list goes on and on. In that speech, Macron himself acknowledged that the French Republic itself was responsible for some of the ghettoization and social isolation that many, like Thomas mentioned earlier, the banlieue neighborhoods on the outskirts of major French cities. I would say, and Simone can correct me if I'm wrong, but he went further than any French president in recent memory has gone on that front, sort of acknowledging the culpability of the Republic in unwittingly advancing this kind of disparities in opportunities and discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. So I think what was really interesting was to hear about that, but then to see how that element more or less essentially vanished from the conversation after the attacks. And you will note that the actual law does not really include much on that front. Although, of course, Macron has charged Benjamin Stora, the great historian of Algeria, with coming up with a kind of commemorating report about how to atone or to come to terms with the colonial history, which he has called a crime against humanity in his 2017 election campaign. So, look, I think headlines get lots of attention, but again, at least from what I can remember, the term systemic racism gets flack because it's seen as an American importation. But when the president of the Republic says that the Republic has indeed been responsible for creating these conditions, and that, as I mentioned earlier, people like Jacques Toubon have said that, police checks disproportionately target certain people of color as opposed to whites. I mean, I'm not sure what else you call it.
Thank you, James. Our next question is from Larry for Thomas. It appears anti-Semitism has increased dramatically in France. Has it always been there, or is it a function on Muslim influx in the country, especially with no-go zones? And how is France responding?
Oh, well, I think it's always been there. I don't think that anti-Semitism is new in France or is introduced by a Muslim population that only has been really present in the country in any significant numbers since after World War II. But it is true that most of the hate crimes that happen today by far happen against Jews in France. It's not even close. And that the preponderance of those attacks against Jews are from French citizens who happen to be of a Muslim descended background. Those are indisputable facts. How has the government responded? I might be less able to speak about that than James is able to speak to that. I'm not exactly sure. I know that France, for many years since I've lived here, since I moved here in 2011, France has been hemorrhaging significant numbers of the Jewish population who have left to other countries, most notably Israel. And around 2015, when the attacks happened and the attack against the kosher supermarket, and that was kind of separated outside of oftentimes in the press, that was separated outside of the larger story of the attacks against the Bataclan and other non-Jewish sites. I know for a fact, just anecdotally, and also from reading Jewish testimonies, that Jews felt abandoned in some ways by the state.
Thank you very much. Our next question goes to James. In the aftermath of Samuel Paty's murder, the French government explained the policies in response. What is your take on these efforts to explain the views of the French government, and has it had an impact on the way the American media can see things?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. The government explained what in the aftermath of Samuel Paty's killing?
The policies in response.
I'm not sure which policies are we?
I imagine it's the I have no idea, but I imagine it's the fight against Islamism.
Okay.
Is that it? I don't know.
I'm guessing it is too. That's all I can think of. But I think yeah, let's go with that. Okay, so like I was saying in response to the previous question, that general campaign against what at the time was called separatism, but which now is called strengthening Republican values, was actually introduced before these attacks. And I think that the attacks and the sort of raw emotion they rightly elicited, I mean, we all share it. I mean, it's just, I mean, it's almost impossible to imagine, you know, a beheading in a Western, I mean, an actual beheading. I mean, it's really just unbelievable. And so that has obviously completely electrified the debate around this topic. Now, I guess the question is how that impacts American opinions of all of this. I think it's been really interesting to observe what appears to be I think like one of the sources of controversy in France is that vis-a-vis American coverage, that there's been, I think, between American observers and French political elites and commentators, there's not a consensus about where the legitimate practice of Islam ends and what the French call, well, we call it too, but what the French mean when they say Islamism and Islamist separatism begins. And I think that that's often the source of the friction. But I mean, I think that's a slightly separate issue than the government's proposals, which are almost, entirely expected and reasonable. I mean, it's nothing. I don't particularly find it controversial. It's banning things like virginity certificates and things like that. I'm not sure it's a major shock to American readers or to American journalists.
Thank you. There is another question for you, which can maybe be seen as a follow-up. The French laïcité is a concept that has been difficult to explain abroad, particularly more so recently. How do you best describe laïcité to an American audience?
Yeah, that is such a good question, and I am very glad that it was asked. I think that laïcité is an incredibly beautiful piece of legislation that is remarkable first and foremost for its inclusivity and for the remarkable amount of tolerance that it shows. So the law passed in 1905 is an official separation of church and state in France, and it follows this sort of anti-clerical campaign of the age. And I think, one thing that's difficult for Americans to understand is that, in France, again, I'm speaking in gross generalizations, but in general, we think of religious freedom as a freedom to, so a defense of religious practice, however you like. And here, although the text of the law permits religious observance of whatever variety, it's largely understood as a freedom from religious authority and manipulation. And I think there often is a perception that the French have a particular issue with Islam, but it's really with sort of organized religion as a whole, I would say. And so I think that that's important for American, that freedom from, freedom to distinction is key. But also I would say that laïcité, Article 1 of laïcité guarantees the freedom of conscience, the freedom to believe or not to believe, but also importantly, the freedom to believe. So this notion that you're not allowed to, that the French state is entirely secular and seeks to strip individual citizens of their religious conviction is not true. No, the law of 1905 guarantees that right. And it is in service of religious observance in individual life. Obviously at the state level, it's entirely neutral, and that's a very important achievement of the law as well. But I think that often gets lost in translation, this notion of, I really do think that in many ways, there's a lot in common between France and the United States on these matters.
Julie, if you permit, I will ask the last question, and sort of, by the way, Thomas, if you want to respond to this as well, but I think you had responded to this at a different interview at some point on the differences, sort of the approach between the United States and France. And from my perspective, it was sort of illustrated at some point a while ago when Trevor Noah had made fun of the French national soccer team, saying that Africa won the World Cup, and to which the then ambassador Gérard Haraud responded that the players were French citizens, basically arguing that that Trevor Noah neglected the Frenchness, implied that whiteness would actually define the French identity. Do you think this incident illustrates to some extent some of the misunderstandings or even different visions of how society is seen?
Is this for me?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, well, you know, it's stunning because, you know, it mirrors the logic precisely of what actual racists and xenophobes think. They don't think those people are really French either. You know, I spent some time in 2017 writing about the French far right and the impact that their thoughts have had on the American alt-right and other right-wing movements around the world. And, you know, some of these people would also say that that team, there's something different about that team, and that they are African or they're Arab and they're not really French, and that if you have to explain it, then it's already a problem. So I think that oftentimes les extrêmes se touchent, and that's really problematic when you have anti-racist thought that is indistinguishable in a vacuum from really problematic racist thought. And I think that it was really good that some of the high-profile players objected to that. It wasn't just the ambassador, but some of the players said, no, look, we're French. And you're diminishing us when you say that, even though, of course, they're proud of their ethnic heritage. But so I think that, you know, he's a comedian, he was making a joke, but it touches on a dynamic that I've spent a lot of time talking about in the United States, which is that oftentimes you get anti-racist to the point where you reify the very same categories you're ostensibly attempting to counteract.
Thank you so much. I'm particularly happy and particularly frustrated, I have to say, because I could talk to you for much longer. There are so many topics that we haven't touched, and we really haven't been able to go into depth into much of them. But I think it was a very interesting sort of you know, slight aspect of some of the conversations that are currently taking place, and I'm really, really happy that we were able to have that conversation. Julie, back to you.
I would like to thank our distinguished guests and our global audience for joining us today. If you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation to AJC at ajc.org/donate. Our next AJC Advocacy Anywhere program will take place on Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Central European Time, and will feature an exclusive conversation with Miss Iraq Sarah Aiden, part of the Dr. Aaron and Ruth Bernstein Distinguished Lecture Series. For more information and to register, please visit ajc.org/advocacy anywhere. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.